I'm John Wilker, the organizer of 360 IDEP. I hope you enjoy this session recording, but first I wanted to mention one thing. We've served the community since 2009, and over the past few years we've had to take on debt in an effort to keep the conference alive. After several unforeseen challenges, not the least of which is a pandemic of indefinite duration, we've had to make the hard choice to end the conference as we're now facing over $100,000 in debt. As a result of requests from the community of how they can help, we've created a GoFundMe campaign. If you're inclined and able, please consider donating to help keep 360 IDEP going. The QR code after this will link you to the campaign. Thank you. Enjoy the recording.
All right, so I think we're ready to start. We start on time? Okay. So this is my first official conference talk, so very exciting. I'm a little nervous, so if you could help me out, and half of you just get up and leave, and I'll let you talk amongst yourselves and figure out which half it's going to be. And then, okay, so for those of you that are going to stay, it's a no code talk. So if you were expecting code and you're going to be disappointed, then that half of you can get up and leave, and now we're a reasonable amount of people for me to talk to. And for everybody that's watching online, just close your laptops, and we're good. So, all right, okay. So, welcome. My talk is "A Picture is Worth 1,000 Lines of Code." I'm Steve Kohls. I'm a principal consultant at Atomic Robot. We're based in Cincinnati, Ohio. And let's get started. I'm going to put my computer glasses on. I'm sure you're all beautiful, but I need to see my slides here versus up there. Okay. So, like I said, it's not a code talk. It's a talk about communication and effective tools to help facilitate that and to help prevent us from having to rewrite a lot of code. And so, what's the problem? So, as developers, we often start coding to requirements that mostly meet what we need. I'm sure we've all kind of been there before. But frequently, there's important details that are missing. And so, as we go through and we're writing our code and we're discovering where we have questions and there's holes, and we're going back and talking to product people or designers, our requirements change. And what does that do? It forces us to rework code that we've already written. Our schedules are now slipping because our estimates are off because we're having to do unplanned work. And then our productivity and morale may suffer as a result. You're getting into crunch time. You still need to meet your deadlines. People are working extra hours. Everybody's unhappy. We don't want to be there. And what we have here is a failure to communicate. As developers, we primarily are communicating with each other through code. But we're also working with other people. We're working with designers and product managers and project managers, and we all speak different professional languages. We talk in code. Designers are giving us designs and wireframes and interactive prototypes. And our product people are giving us requirements and specification documents. And the project managers are really communicating in schedules and budgets and deadlines. And so, because we're talking all these different languages, we often miss important details. And we don't necessarily see that up front in the planning stages or when we're just starting to get into code. Or we misunderstand some of the requirements because maybe something's not explicit, or everybody's reading in different things that are assumed but not written down. And so we build systems, we build apps that don't necessarily meet our needs or our customers' needs. And often we just end up writing and rewriting a lot of code as we discover these problems along the way. So it's not my fault. But really, we're all complicit here. It's not good enough for us just to write code. That is the biggest part of our job, but we also have to communicate effectively, not only to other developers, but to everybody else on the team. And we have to make our needs known. It's not our job just to take what's given to us and crank out the code. If we can't talk and say, hey, this thing is missing, I don't understand this, what about this other thing, how does this work on iOS versus Android, we're not going to build the right things. And we need to be proactive about that. We can't wait until the last minute to say, oh, I've been thinking about this and whatever, and now it's 3 months into the project. As soon as those things are apparent to you, communicate, make sure they're known. That's our job as much as it is to, churn out the Swift code. And so what can we do about this? So you probably have heard the phrase, a picture is worth 1,000 words. What does that really mean? So we can go to Wikipedia and, you could read everything you want to about the Mona Lisa and the history and, scholarly debates and the techniques that were used in doing the painting. Is there something hidden underneath it? Why do her eyes always follow you wherever you go? But if you've never seen the painting before, you don't have that context. You don't really know what people are talking about. And so I can just show you the picture. And if we've all seen that, then we can dive into the details and be able to discuss things. And we all have a common frame of reference. And you didn't need all of those words to say, look at this painting, let's talk about it now in more detail. And so if a picture is worth 1,000 words, can a picture be worth 1,000 lines of code, 1,000 lines of rewritten code? And so this is what we normally start out with. We have some API descriptions, we have some wireframes and designs, might have some existing code that we've written, and we have a whole bunch of walls of text of specifications and requirements documents. And there's a lot of different languages that are being spoken there, but there's nothing that really pulls it all together and gives us kind of a common frame of reference and a succinct picture as to how all of this fits together. And so I'm a very visual person, and so it's a lot easier for me to look at a picture and understand the shape of a system. Other people learn different ways, but instead of looking at all of these different disparate documents and no really summation, what if we could look at something like this instead? And so this is what I call an interaction diagram, and it's just a comprehensive picture of what our app looks like, the interactions between the code and the design, the user, and helps to capture all of those things that in the end need to go into our code. And then it can serve as a communications tool to help bridge the gap between us as developers, between designers who are giving us these screens that we need to move between, between our customer or our product managers who are writing the requirements and telling us what we need to build. And so it's no Mona Lisa, but it's not meant to be. It doesn't have to be beautiful. And so that said, interaction diagrams give us this concise picture, and it gives us a communication tool now that we can look at this and talk about things with other people on our team. And it helps us work together to fill in the blanks, especially when things are missing that we maybe don't know about upfront. But diagrams don't replace those other documents. It supplements them and helps unify them. Okay. So if I'm going to build one of these diagrams, how do I do it? And this talk is not just about introducing the diagrams, but giving you basically a checklist of how you can implement these for yourself. And so in the end, what the diagram is going to show is it's going to capture all of our screens, but at a very low fidelity. Everything's going to be basically a block diagram. It's going to show the happy path navigation through our app. And so if everything goes right and you hit OK and it takes you to the next screen, great. But it also shows all those alternate paths, going back, canceling out of something, retrying an operation. Also captures all of those async operations like API calls. Waiting state indicators for all of those long-running operations, and then showing error handling behavior as well. And so, so here's our diagram, and let's dive into an actual checklist. So there's going to be a lot here, so I'll kind of move through it somewhat quickly. If you have questions, if you can ask at the end or put them in the Slack channel, and then we can refer to those at the end, and I can kind of answer everything all at once. All right, so a couple steps here. Getting started, capturing what we already know about, noting what's missing, asking questions, and getting answers, that whole communication process, and then filling in the blanks when we're done. And I've got these all in kind of a procedural order. That's really not what happens when you do this for real, but it's at least a good way to introduce everything. All right. So first step, when we get started, we want to choose a drawing tool. We want to pick a style for how we're going to communicate. And then we want to plan for sharing that. So there's a lot of different tools out there. I like paper, and I drew this in like 15 minutes on the airplane. And I almost always have like 20 pens and markers and highlighters and pencils and stuff with me. And pen and paper is a great place to start, but it doesn't get you easily to sharing. Same thing with whiteboards. So what's the next step? There are a lot of great online block diagram applications you can use. There's a lot of desktop apps that allow for sharing as well. There's some great iPad apps out there as well. I almost always do my first pass on paper just to kind of get a shape of how big is this diagram and how many things do I need to cram into it and how am I going to organize it. And then I'll start to transfer that into an electronic form. And I'll give some recommendations for all of that at the end of the talk. All right, so next, style. There's no real hard and fast rules here. This is meant to be something that works for you, works for your team. And so pick a style and a tool and a look and feel that applies to what you're building. Make sure if you're using color to differentiate between different types of screens, different things in the diagram, that you also use shape as well. We talk a lot about accessibility. If somebody has color deficiencies, red and pink are probably not going to help you a lot if somebody has a hard time distinguishing those. So rounded corners, circles, whatever works to help highlight differences in your diagram. And be consistent. So once you pick a style or a shape or whatever, use those consistently throughout. And if you need to add a key, if things are getting complex, you have a lot of colors or whatever, put a key on there so that you can look at the diagram and anybody can see, oh, okay, I know that's a modal. And I just skipped something here. Oh. Okay. And then, like I said, plan for sharing. In order for this to be an effective communication tool, you need to be able to share this diagram. Now a lot of us work remote. You can't just stand in front of a whiteboard and have your teammates draw stuff together and be able to share that. And so having that available electronically in the cloud somehow is really important. And anybody should be able to edit and make suggestions on those diagrams as well. You shouldn't have sole ownership of it, which helps you share the load and keep that diagram up to date. You know, we're all human. We all sometimes hate writing documentation. And so if your team all has access, then you can distribute that work amongst other people. All right. So next step, and this is the biggest one, is actually looking at all of those designs and specs and existing code and APIs and capturing all of that in one place. And so, like I said, like I started to say, a good first step is capturing all the screens, and I'm going to walk through this and come back to it. Happy path, your typical back and cancel and exit paths, async, waiting state indicators, and then all of the async error and retry and cancel. All right. So capturing all the screens. Like I said, simple boxes are great. Only add the detail you require. This is not a design diagram. Use shape and color to differentiate, especially between full screen presentation and modals. And I need a diagram here and I forgot it, so we'll go on to the next one. So the happy path. So that ideal state where everything happens instantaneously and there's no errors, that's the next step. And so adding lines as you transition from screen to screen, if they're triggered by a button, maybe drawing a little button in there that says next. And so on paper, you might end up with some mess that looks like this. And so I tend to scribble things out and end up with all my boxes are too big, and then I take that piece of paper and I throw it away, and then I pick up another piece of paper and I redraw it, and I do that about 10 times until I've got everything there and my handwriting is awful and I've highlighted everything and X'd stuff out, but all the things I know about now are on one piece of paper, and maybe I've already written some questions in. And then I take that and I make something that looks like this. So it's got that block diagram of each screen and an arrow that takes me from one to the next. And sometimes in our designs or our specs, this is kind of all we get, which kind of leads us into the problem, why are we doing this in the first place? There's a lot missing here. And so the example that I'm showing is basically a onboarding and sign in, log in, sign up kind of flow, and we build those all the time. All right, so next step. We've got that happy path, but there's always the back button. There's always canceling out of something or exiting out of this particular feature into the higher level app. And so capturing those things explicitly for every path, for every navigation path is really important. And a lot of times we're on projects where you have that happy path, but the back button flow isn't indicated because it's, oh yeah, it just goes back to the other screen. But what if it doesn't? What if it goes back 2 screens or 3 screens? Make sure that that's on your diagram. Again, add lines for every transition. And so now I realize this is a little tight, but we now have arrows for where things go if they go back and where things go if you cancel. And so, you might be in your sign up flow and you've typed in some information and you've typed in your address and you're starting to enter your payment information and they're like, you know what, I don't want to do this. Or, oh, I remember, I do have a login. And so you hit that cancel button. It's not going to take you back one screen. It takes you all the way back to that initial sign in, sign up screen. And so being explicit, putting everything on there for every path and not making any assumptions is really important. For iOS versus Android, this is even more important because Android, we have our soft buttons that let you get out and whatever, but iOS, you're using gestures, or you've got the back button in the upper left, and they're often in our requirements, in our design diagrams, you might just have the iOS design or the Android design. And I've worked with a lot of Android developers, and we end up building the same app differently because everybody's making assumptions about, oh, well, I think this goes back to here. But it doesn't on mine because we didn't communicate that. All right, so the next thing to capture is all of our asynchronous operations. So anything that takes a long time, web API calls, maybe you're doing some computation, you're doing something with MLKit, or you're talking to some IoT device. None of that stuff happens instantaneously. So make sure that you capture that on the diagram. And this is probably one of the first places where you'll see things that you were building in code that might not have been in your design, that now you're starting to unify all of those documents you get from other people and what you build in code. And so adding those lines to hook everything up, putting in that happy path, and so now we end up with something like this. And so now instead of going from screen to screen, we have these things of, oh, I'm going to hit the login endpoint, or I'm going to hit the, validating my new username and password. Validating my address against the US Postal Service is a really confusing and complicated API. Or like talking to Stripe and validating payment information. But again, none of those things happen instantaneously. And so whenever we have some long-running operation and we want to tell the user, hey, something's happening, you're going to need all those waiting state indicators. And there's a lot of different ways we can do that. A lot of times we just have a modal pop up, or there's some on-screen indicator, on our current screen, or something in the button, or a full screen, hey, it's processing. Those are a lot of different ways we can do things. Make sure that you add those to the diagram and kind of highlight things. And so here, I've got the purple squares that are modals, and I've got on the lower right, there's that light blue rectangle that's a full screen processing screen. And I realize now I need a key here to tell you what all the different colors and shapes are, but and so now we've captured not only screen to screen to screen, and when we're doing async stuff, when we're telling the user something's happening, and also kind of how we're telling them. And again, in any of those long-running processes, nothing ever goes according to plan. So there's lots of error conditions. Did I lose a slide here? Okay, I think I did. All right, so we have error conditions. Maybe your username and password didn't meet the requirements. It has to be 8 characters and uppercase and lowercase, whatever. Or the system was down when you tried to ping the endpoint and you need to retry. Or this is taking way too long, I want to cancel out. So anytime when you have like a retry, and so you can see those kind of pinkish boxes now, and of course my cursor can't highlight over them. And in this case, I'm looking at our payment validation. You might have some general error. Oh, you get a 500, the service isn't available. And I want to show the user some generic error message. Or maybe your credit card isn't valid, or it's expired. And I might want to show a different message for that error code. Make sure to differentiate those on the diagram itself. and show, once that thing is presented and it's dismissed, where do you go from there? But you also might want to retry that. The endpoint was down momentarily. Allow the user to hit a retry button, and it'll ping it again, and show where does that retry path go. And so you can see if I toggle between those, I've just got one more option on there to retry. And then cancel paths as well. And this is one where I added the cancel path too early, but you can see it below that blue box of any of those async operations. If you want to cancel, make sure that you're explicit. It's in your diagram. All right, so that was a lot of stuff. Typically, when I'm building one of these diagrams and I'm scratching it out on paper, I'm not going through this checklist in that particular order. I'm just looking at what I see in my specs and I know in my code and just writing everything all out at once. There's a great book called The Checklist Manifesto, and what they talk about, I see some heads nodding, is that as experts in some field, we know how to do stuff. Nobody has to tell us and give us instructions, but we forget things a lot because we're going through it quickly or we're distracted or whatever. And so having a checklist that you can refer to and say, oh, you know what, I did forget about being able to cancel this, and it wasn't in my design and I need to ask somebody. It's more of a reminder for those things that we already know that you don't forget. All right, so we've captured everything that was already written down, that was in our code, that was in a design. There's always something that's missing. There's always, oh, I looked at the API spec and there's no rate limiting in here for how many times I can ping the login endpoint and just guess at people's emails to see if they have an account. So what do? This is a communication tool. Whenever there's something that is missing, whenever there's a question of, oh, did we want this to be a modal or did we want it to be a full screen? You didn't show it in the design. Write those things down, just write on the diagram. Be explicit and say, I need to know this thing, and make it stand out. Put it in red, put it in all caps. Unfortunately, we can't make it flash. Having all of that spelled out in the document when you're sharing it to other people encourages those people kind of subliminally maybe to provide you answers. Because now if a lot of people are looking at this, somebody's like, oh, there's this big thing in red. Why isn't that answered? It starts to look messy and ugly, but maybe that helps. And so once you have all of that stuff captured, your questions are on there, what you already know is on there, it's time to actually ask some questions of other people. So sharing with the entire team, saying, hey, I've got this is what we know about, but this is what we don't know. Sharing that out, itemizing the issues, making a list, making a spreadsheet, sending an email, whatever, and then calling a meeting. And I think this is the most important thing, getting all of the stakeholders, getting everybody who's involved in specifying this app, building the app, doing the designs, making the decisions together in one place, either physically or virtually, and saying, we've got all the people in the room who can answer these questions. Here's the questions. Let's answer what we can so that we don't run into problems later in the development cycle. And get those answers. If people can't answer them right away, make sure you follow up. Don't make assumptions about what the answer might be because somebody didn't answer. There's a good tool I've heard of called the Happy Meal test. And when Ray Kroc started McDonald's, and he knew that hungry parents with hungry kids are coming in and they see this big giant menu and there's 100 things to choose from. What do I choose? Somebody's screaming. Enter the Happy Meal. You can choose a hamburger or a cheeseburger and you get a prize with it, and that's it. And so if you're not getting answers to your questions, a really good tool is to say, we have option A, we have option B, pick one. And that's a good kind of facilitator to get an answer if you're having trouble. If you have a project manager, this is the perfect time to engage them, because this is what they do, this is what they know and love, is making things happen smoothly. And if you aren't getting answers or you have a whole list of questions, sick them on the rest of your team and have them go and do what they do well. And then once you have all of those answers, you need to write down everything on the diagram and empower your team to do the same thing. They don't have to tell you, oh, I figured out it's going to be when you cancel, it goes back 3 screens. Let them put the arrow in and erase the question mark that was in your diagram. So hopefully we end up with something like this that doesn't have the big red bold question marks on it. And I want to talk a little bit about my experience and where this came from. And I was working on a project where we were having these problems. And then I was working on another one, and I'm like, this has to stop. We can't keep running into these crunches at the end because we aren't communicating what we need, and other people are building something different on the web side or the Android side. And so when we started to build these diagrams, what we found was that it was significantly improving the communication between the teams. And in my experience talking with our back-end development team, like, hey, we really need this on the API side. I saw this inconsistency. We're rate limiting this, but we're not that. Should we be doing that? They're like, oh yeah. And we're getting these errors back as strings from this endpoint, but on this other one, they're just error codes. And we're like, for localization, it'd be really nice to just give us back error codes. They're like, oh, that'd be fantastic, because we didn't want to send you strings anyway. And so you end up building these really good relationships because you're helping improve each other's work by communicating all of these questions and problems you have. And you're discovering these pieces, as you're building this diagram before you're going off to build the thing for real. And as different parts of the team started using this, especially our Android and iOS developers, were like, hey, this really helps us, get on the same page up front. People really wanted to use this and started building them on their own. And so now we had a tool that we started using on future projects. And it really, in the end, improved the quality of our future designs and specs, because now the designer was aware that they needed to provide us different text for 5 different errors for this particular endpoint, instead of, oh, an error happened, hit OK. It's like, well, we need to retry, or, oh, you can't retry because this is invalid. And so instead of having to ask those things after the fact, we started to see specs that already had all that spelled out, or that most of the weighting indicators were already in the design, and one was full screen and one was modal, and it was all appropriate to the platform. And our project started to run a little closer to what we estimated. There's no silver bullet, and this certainly isn't. But having those questions answered earlier in the process always helps. So some recommendations. This is not a formal diagramming process. It's not UML. It's not any of the other processes you've maybe seen in school or in practice. Do what works best for your team, what's easy and quick and is succinct and makes sense to everybody. Make sure to ask those questions on the diagram. Put everything in one place. And don't be afraid to get messy. I mean, you saw my diagram from afar. Oops. And it really is ugly. And stuff is written on top of each other and stuff is scratched out. And if it looks that way electronically, that's okay as long as you are capturing all of that information. Information density is not a bad thing. Maybe you need to move some boxes around to make it a little bit more understandable, but it's not the Mona Lisa and it doesn't have to be. Be explicit. You don't want to, this is where you're not wanting to have assumptions about how things work. If you're about to say, oh, I think it's going to go here, no, don't do that. Spell it out. I don't know where I should go when I hit cancel and get that answer. So a picture is worth 1,000 words. We talked about that with the Mona Lisa. Can a picture be worth 1,000 lines of code? I know I've had to rewrite a lot of things because I didn't have questions answered that I would have liked to have had ahead of time. It's a communication tool, and it's going to help you get closer to other members of your team, help build those, foster those lines of communication. And kind of saying these things as I go. Who wants to rewrite 1,000 lines of code? I know I don't. That's why I use these diagrams. And hopefully that makes us all a little bit happier people, less stress, less unplanned time and rework. I said I'd answer some questions at the end. People have asked me in the past about recommended drawing tools, and I know there's a lot of stuff up here. The ones in orange are ones that I've used. But like I said earlier, paper and pen is a really great place to start, or on a whiteboard, because you can get stuff down and out of your brain really quickly. And then move to some other tool like Lucidchart I use. There's a diagrams.net or draw.io. Both of those integrate with Google Drive really well, and the Google apps. OmniGraffle is another. Back in the day, I used Visio a lot from Microsoft, which is a great tool. Unfortunately, it's really expensive, and I don't think it shares well. There are also a lot of really good iPad apps out there. I've used Paper on the iPad before. And so I've boiled this all down. I've got a checklist on a GitHub repo, and I've shared that in the Slack channel as well. And the slides should be up there also. So questions? You raise your hand, or I think we've got some Slack questions. Vui?
Yeah, someone asked if they used OmniGraffle diagrams.
Yeah. And I've not used OmniGraffle. I know there's probably some old school Mac developers in here that have probably been using it for years. It's a great tool. Like I said, most of my tool usage has been online applications. So any other questions? I'm going to switch glasses so I can see you instead of my screen. Sorry. All right, go ahead. Okay. So the question is, when you want to start drawing one of these diagrams, how do you get everyone to agree, what to do, how to do it, when to do it? And in my experience, because there was nothing there, I wanted to be proactive and just say, you know what, nobody's providing me these questions, these answers, or these tools. I'm just going to do it myself. And so, kind of as a kickstart to that process, you do it. Pick whatever tool you think is going to be easy to share. If there's a way that you like to draw diagrams, just do it. And get that captured first, and then share it out and say, I'm doing this thing, and start to gather input. That's a quick way to do it. If you want to get some consensus ahead of time, pull your team together, or probably an easier way is ask a couple individual people on different teams that maybe you already have a good working relationship with, and say, I want to build this diagram. Does anybody have a favorite way of doing things, or a way that they would like to do things, and go from there? Does that help? Really, there's no hard and fast rules or process. So yeah, okay. And so for everybody online, so the comment was, for those of us that are engineers and building the code, the designer or the product people think they've got everything, and they've got this perfect mock, and they say, here you go, and we're done, and we're walking away. What you're trying to communicate is the complexity of the things that they don't know about, that you do as a developer, and that things that were missed. And so, if we were building an app just in a black box, black hole kind of world, and you thought you knew what the design should be, but you didn't look at a designer's documents, there are going to be things that you miss about how the app should be built, because that's not your expertise. And so what you're trying to communicate is, this is my area of expertise. This is, I know how to build the app. I might not be the best designer, but you as a designer, aren't an expert coder. There are things that you may not know about. You think you're done, but you might not be. Or, the back-end engineers know that, hey, there's rate limiting, or there's these additional 3 error codes that the designers didn't know about. They thought they were done, but they're not. And so it's more of a kind of a grassroots thing to use to kind of push back against people when they say, hey, we're done, and we need to be, done on, January 1st, let's go. It gives you a tool to say, hey, wait a minute. If I don't have these answers, I'm not going to hit that deadline. If I don't know what this piece is that it's supposed to look like because you weren't aware of it, I'm not going to satisfy, a meticulous designer that says, oh, well, that looks awful. I didn't design that. It's like, well, you didn't tell me because you didn't know. And so it's really kind of a, guerrilla engineering of kind of you creating a communication tool that then you can show other people and say, here's this one little spot that we missed something. So hopefully that answers the question. Any other questions? Yeah, and so the comment was, another tool is Mermaid, which works really well, I think, with Markdown, and lets you describe your diagrams textually, and it's really easy to diff. And so, in doing PRs and contributing your code to GitHub as part of your repo and your code, you've got this diagram that's written in text. And I have heard of Mermaid. Another one, if you use Figma, Figma has a tool called FigJam that is more of a block diagramming tool as well. So I think we're out of time. Any more quick questions? No? Thank you very much. So if you need to reach me, there's my email, and I'm at Steve Kohls pretty much everywhere: Twitter, GitHub, Stack Overflow, LinkedIn. So, all right, thank you.